The assembly of concordant worlds met in a hall carved from a single tooth of ice, a fang of frozen methane older than most of the species who sat beneath it. Light filtered blue through the translucent walls and pooled on the floor like water that had forgotten how to move. 2,000 delegates occupied the tiered rings, and above them all, on the highest tier where the light was thinnest, sat the Directorate, the 9 oldest civilizations in the Concord, the ones who had drawn the borders and written the treaties and decided, across 10,000 years, which species were worth keeping and which were left to drift. On that particular cycle, they were deciding about the humans. The human delegation sat low, in the outer ring where the newest members were always placed, where the acoustics were poor and the seats were hard and the message was clear before a single word was spoken. You are here on sufferance, and we can hear you only if we choose to. There were 6 of them. 5 were the sort of gray-templed officials every species sent to places like this, people who had learned to survive in rooms where nothing was ever quite said. The 6th was a girl. Her name was Sena Adeyemi, and she was 23 years old, which by the reckoning of the Concord made her barely more than an egg. Most of the ancient species did not send their young anywhere. The young were kept behind walls until their edges wore smooth, until they had unlearned the reckless certainty that made the old ones nervous. Humanity did not do this. Humanity sent Sena because Sena had, in 4 short years, become the best translator their species had ever produced, not of language, which the Concord's implants handled well enough, but of intent. She could sit in a room full of beings who had spent millennia learning to say one thing and mean another, and she could tell you what they meant. It was a talent nobody had taught her. It was simply the way she was built. She was watching the Directorate now. She had been watching them for the entire session, and she did not like what she saw. The petition of the human worlds, intoned the speaker, a Vorlethi whose long gray body coiled around the central dais like smoke around a candle, is for full voting membership in the Concord, with the accompanying protections of the Mutual Defense Compact. The delegation asserts that human contributions to the frontier have earned this status. The Directorate will now render its assessment. Sena felt the 5 officials beside her go tense. This was the moment they had crossed 40 light years to reach. Humanity had been in the Concord for 60 years as an associate species, present but voiceless, defended but not defending, allowed to trade and travel and bleed for the common defense of the frontier without any of the rights that came with belonging. They had held the Meridian Gap for 11 years. They had lost 30,000 people doing it. They had come, at last, to ask that this mean something. The eldest of the Directorate rose. She was a Thren, a being like a cathedral made of pale coral, and her name sound translated only approximately as Valoran. When she spoke, the hall went so quiet that Sena could hear the ice singing faintly above them, the slow music of a glacier under its own weight. We have considered the human petition, Valoran said, with the seriousness it deserves. She let the words settle. Sena's stomach tightened, because she had learned that when the old ones told you they were being serious, they were preparing to be cruel. The Concord is not a reward for effort. It is a stewardship of the mature. We do not question that the human worlds have expended themselves on the frontier. Effort is common. The frontier consumes species like fuel. Those who burn brightest often burn first. What the Concord requires is not effort but permanence, the demonstrated capacity to endure across ages, to govern without passion, to persist. Humanity is 60 years in our company. Your civilization is not yet 300,000 years old. You have not shown us that you will survive your own adolescence, let alone ours. A murmur ran through the tiers. It was not sympathy. It was agreement. Therefore, Valoran continued, the Directorate declines the petition for full membership. We extend, in its place, an indefinite continuation of associate status, under which the human worlds may continue to contribute to the common defense and to enjoy the Concord's protection. She inclined her great pale head a fraction, and there was something in the gesture that was almost kind, which was the worst part. This is not a rejection. It is patience. Come to us again in 10,000 years, and we will look at you with fresh eyes. 10,000 years. The lead human official, a man named Harker whose entire career had been built around this day, sat very still. Sena watched the muscles work in his jaw. She watched him decide to be gracious, to thank them, to accept, because that was what associate species did. They accepted, and they came back, and they accepted again, and this was the shape of a relationship the Concord had maintained with 100 younger species for 100,000 years. Endless patience, endless deferral, a hand always extended and never quite taken. But Sena was not looking at Harker anymore. She was looking at the directorate, at the small movements passing between the 9 of them, the flickers and shifts that the implants did not translate because they were not meant to be heard. And what she read there made her cold. They were not deferring humanity. They had decided about humanity. The associate status was not patience. It was a leash size to fit forever. The directorate had looked at the human worlds and concluded that they were exactly what the Concord needed. A species reckless enough to hold the ugly borders, brave enough to die in the gaps, too young to demand a share, and too grateful to leave. Humanity was not a candidate for membership. Humanity was a resource that had figured out how to volunteer. Sena understood this in the space of 3 heartbeats, and then, before Harker could rise to give his gracious little speech, before the machinery of deferral could close around her species for another 10,000 years, she stood up. She was in the outer ring. The acoustics were poor. By every rule of the assembly she should not have been heard at all. But she had spent 4 years learning how the ice hall carried sound, learning that if you stood in the seam between the 3rd and 4th tiers and pitched your voice into the curve of the wall, the whole geometry of the place would carry you to the directorate as clearly as if you stood at the dais. She had never used this. She had noticed it, filed it away, the way she noticed everything, and now she used it. "Then we decline," Sena said. The 2 words crossed the hall and struck the highest tier and stopped the ice from singing. Harker turned to stare at her. The 5 officials stared. 2,000 delegates turned in their seats, and the great pale bulk of Valoran shifted with a sound like a wave withdrawing from a beach. "The associate species has spoken out of turn," the speaker said, uncoiling in agitation. "It has no standing to." "The human worlds," Sena said, louder now, and she stepped down from her seat and walked into the pool of blue light at the center of the outer ring so that they could all see the egg who had dared. "Decline the Concord's patience. We decline associate status. We decline the protection of the compact. As of this moment, on the authority I carry, humanity withdraws its petition, withdraws its forces from the meridian gap, and withdraws from the Concord of Worlds entirely. We are leaving." The silence that followed was not the silence of a hall gone quiet. It was the silence of a hall that did not understand. Because in the whole recorded history of the Concord, no one had ever left. Species were admitted or deferred or occasionally, when they broke the deep laws, destroyed. But no species had ever simply stood up in the ice hall and announced that it was done. It had never happened because it was, to the ancient minds arranged on the tiers above, unthinkable, the equivalent of a limb announcing that it would prefer to be a bird. The Concord was the world. There was nothing outside it but the dark and the frontier and the things the Concord held the frontier against. To leave was not defiance. It was madness. It was suicide. Valoran regarded the girl, standing alone in the blue light. "You do not carry that authority," the Thren said, and for the first time there was the faintest imperfection in her enormous calm, not doubt, but the effort of maintaining certainty. No delegate carries the authority to unmake a species' entire relationship with the Concord on the floor of the assembly. "I do," Sena said. "We knew what you would say. We have known for a year. The human worlds authorized this delegation to accept full membership, or, if it was refused, to withdraw, ratified by all 40 settled worlds and the assembly of Earth. I am not asking you to release us. I am informing you that we are gone." She looked up at the 9 of them, at 10,000 years of certainty arranged in a ring of light, and she did the thing that no young creature was ever supposed to do in front of the old. She smiled at them, and it was not an angry smile, and it was not a frightened one. It was the smile of someone who had seen the whole board and knew something the other player did not. You looked at us and you saw fuel. I understand. You've been burning younger species for so long you've forgotten they can walk. So we're going to walk. And someday, not in 10,000 years, but soon, sooner than any of you believe possible, you are going to sit in this room and you are going to understand exactly what you decided today. I hope you remember that I told you first. Then Sena Adeyemi turned her back on the directorate of the Concord of Worlds, which was itself a thing no associate delegate had ever done and lived to see repeated, and she walked out of the ice hall. After a long, stunned moment, the 5 gray-templed officials rose and followed her, and the doors of frozen methane closed behind the last human in the assembly with a sound like the sea freezing over. On the highest tier, Valoran of the Thren looked at the empty space where the human delegation had been, and felt, for the first time in 9,000 years, a sensation she could not immediately name. It would take her some time to identify it. When she finally did, much later, when it was much too late, she would recognize it as the first cold thread of dread. But that came later. On the day humanity walked away, the conquered did what the conquered always did when a young species behaved unwisely. It noted the event, entered it into the eternal record, and moved on to the next petition. A withdrawal was a curiosity. A single species, small and brief and unimportant, had thrown away the greatest gift the galaxy could offer. They would regret it. They would come crawling back within the decade, having discovered how cold and how full of teeth the dark beyond the conquered truly was, and the directorate would receive them with the same infinite patience, and everything would be as it had always been. That was the assessment. It was rendered by 9 of the oldest and wisest minds in the galaxy, minds that had watched empires rise and crumble like tide lines, and it was wrong in every particular, and none of them would understand how wrong until the day the meridian gap fell silent, and the first of the old, patient horrors came pouring through into a galaxy that had, without ever noticing, forgotten how to fight. The delegates filed out of the ice hall when the session ended. The next petition was heard. The frontier, 30 light-years away, held for one more day, because 30,000 human beings were still standing in the gap and had not yet received the order to come home. By the following dawn they had, and they came. The meridian gap was not a place so much as an absence, a stretch of the frontier 40 light-years wide, where the shield of dead stars that ringed the conquered's territory thinned to almost nothing. Beyond it lay the vast, the unmapped dark, and in the vast lived things the conquered did not name because naming them gave them a shape in the mind, and the old species had learned long ago that some shapes were better left unformed. For 11 years, humanity had held the gap. When the order to withdraw came, it came as a single compressed pulse to the fleet command station orbiting a burnt-out sun, and the human who received it was a woman named Colonel Idris, and she read it twice, and then she began, methodically, to bring her people home. It took 9 days to withdraw 30,000 people and their ships and their guns from a line 40 light-years long. In those 9 days, the conquered watched with the detached interest of a physician observing a patient do something inadvisable. The picket stations that flanked the human sector, crewed by the Sethuvian and the Coral and the several dozen other associate and full species who shared the burden of the frontier, reported the withdrawal up the chain, and the chain shrugged. The humans were being petulant. They would hold their positions from spite even as they officially resigned, because that was what species did. Nobody actually abandoned a frontier post. The line would remain. The bodies in it would simply change color. But the humans did abandon it. On the 9th day, the last human ship crossed back through the picket line and did not slow down and did not stop. And Colonel Idris sent a final transmission to the Sethuvian commander, who held the sector beside hers. an old soldier named Osk, with whom she had shared 11 years of the worst kind of work. "The gap is yours, Osk," she said. "I'm sorry, I truly am. It's the only leverage we have, and if we don't use it now, we never will. Watch the third harmonic. When the vast goes quiet, it isn't resting, it's counting." Osk, who was a good soldier and a decent creature, and had never had any say in what the directorate decided, watched the human fleet dwindle to nothing on his displays and felt the cold of the empty sector reach into his ship. "How long do we have?" he asked. There was a pause. "You held it before we came," Idris said. "You'll hold it now. You have the numbers. You have better ships than us. You have everything we had except one thing, and I hope to every god you never find out what that thing was." Then the human ships jumped, and the sector belonged to the Concord again, and Osk turned to the business of redistributing his forces to cover a whole 40 light-years wide, and told himself it would be fine. For 8 months it was fine. Sena Adeyemi spent those 8 months on Earth, in a gray building in a rebuilt city, being blamed. The withdrawal had been ratified by all 40 worlds, but ratifying a thing and living with it were different acts. And as the months passed and the Concord did not come crawling to beg humanity back, as the trade routes closed and the technology transfers stopped, and the small conveniences of belonging to the galaxy's great club were withdrawn one by one, the mood on the human worlds curdled. People had expected the Concord to panic. Instead, the Concord had simply turned its enormous back, and it turned out that being ignored by the galaxy was in some ways worse than being exploited by it. There were shortages. There were recessions. There were politicians who had voted for the walkout and now discovered urgent reasons to have always opposed it, and every one of them found it convenient to point at the girl who had stood up in the ice hall. Sena bore it. She was 24 now, and she had learned that being right early was indistinguishable, to most people, from being wrong. She sat in hearings and explained, again and again, what she had read on the faces of the directorate, that humanity had been sorted into a category from which no amount of good behavior would ever release them, that they had been designated permanent fuel, and that the only move left on the board was to remove themselves from it entirely and make the Concord feel the shape of the whole. She was not always believed. But she was not lying, and some people can tell the difference, and she kept her seat at the table because a handful of those people kept putting her back in it. "Explain it to me again," said the old woman who ran the Assembly of Earth, a former soldier named Prime Coordinator Vance, who had lost a daughter in the gap and had voted for withdrawal with her eyes open. "Not the politics, the thing under the politics. Why did you believe leaving would work when everyone with gray hair in this building believed it would ruin us?" Sena thought about how to say it. "Because I watched them for 4 years, she said. "And in 4 years I never once saw them afraid. Not of the vast, not of each other, not of anything. They've been safe for so long they've forgotten what safety is made of. They think safety is a property of the Concord, something the institution has like a color. It isn't. Safety is a thing that gets done over and over by people willing to stand in the dark and do it. The Concord stopped doing it 100,000 years ago. They handed it down to younger species one at a time, and the younger species handed it down again, and now the actual work of holding the frontier is done almost entirely by associates. By us. By the Sethuvian. By whoever's newest and most desperate to belong." She looked at Vance. "They don't know that. That's the whole thing. They genuinely don't know that we were the ones holding it. They think we were fuel in someone else's fire. They have no idea we were the fire." Vance was quiet for a while. "And when they find out?" "They won't find out from an argument," Sena said. "They'll find out from the dark, and by then it will be very, very late." She was closer to right than even she knew, because on the 241st day after humanity withdrew, the third harmonic changed in the meridian gap, and Commander Osk of the Sethuvian, who had listened for it every single day because a human had told him to, felt his ship go cold and knew, with the certainty of a soldier who has run out of good options, that the counting had stopped. What came through the gap did not have a name. The Concord's oldest records held only fragments, warnings passed down from the founding species who had built the ring of dead stars specifically to keep such things in the vast. The humans, in 11 years of holding the gap, had catalogued them exhaustively, given them working names, mapped their movements, learned the rhythm of their incursions, which was the third harmonic, the slow subsonic pulse that ran ahead of them like the pressure wave before a flood. Humanity had turned the holding of the gap into a science, an ugly and expensive and endlessly refined science, and they had taken every page of it with them when they left. The Concord had the records, but the records were 100,000 years old, and no one living had ever fought the things in them, and there is a difference, an absolute and unbridgeable difference, between knowing that a thing is dangerous and knowing what to do when it is coming through the line at you in the dark. Osk did everything right. He raised the alarm on every channel. He brought his forces into the defensive formation the Concord's ancient manuals prescribed. He was brave, and his crews were brave, and their ships were, exactly as Idris had said, better than anything humanity had ever flown. And it did not matter, because the formation in the ancient manual had been designed by minds that had never actually used it, refined in theory across 100 millennia of peace, and it was wrong in a dozen small ways that only became visible when the enemy was actually upon you. And by the time you saw the ways it was wrong, you were already dying. The first incursion breached the gap in 11 hours. Osk's sector fell in 19. He held long enough to get most of his civilians out and to send, on the old human command frequency that no one used anymore, a single transmission into the empty dark where the human fleet had gone. Idris, he said, into a channel he was almost certain no one was listening to. It's the third harmonic. You were right. It's the third harmonic, and I don't know what to do, and I have no one to ask. If you can hear me. The transmission ended there, not because Osk stopped speaking, but because there was no longer a ship for him to speak from. The pulse reached the Directorate 4 days later, compressed through 100 relays, and Valoran of the Thren listened to a dead Sethuvian's last words in the ice hall where humanity had walked away. And she understood, finally and completely and far too late, what she had been unable to name 8 months before. The thing she had felt was dread, and the reason she had felt it was that some ancient part of her, older than her certainty, had recognized the girl in the blue light for what she truly was. Not an egg, not fuel, but the one member of the entire human delegation who had understood the actual balance of the galaxy, and had told the Directorate the truth, and had been disbelieved, because the truth was unthinkable. The frontier was falling, and the only species that knew how to hold it had walked away, and taken the knowledge with them, and was not answering its transmissions. The Directorate did not panic, because the Directorate had not panicked in 100,000 years and had no living memory of how. What it did instead was worse. It deliberated. While the second and third incursions came through the widening breach in the Meridian Gap, while the Coral Sector fell, and then the HFY picket line behind it, while entire associate species began evacuating outward toward the galactic core in a slow tide of refugee ships, the 9 oldest minds in the galaxy met in the ice hall and applied to the crisis the only tool they had ever needed: patience, and the certainty that the institution would hold. The frontier has always fluctuated, said the Vorlethi speaker, who was not on the Directorate but was permitted to advise it. Incursions occur. They are repelled. This is the rhythm of the border. We need only redeploy full-member forces to stabilize the line. Full-member forces have not held a frontier line in 90,000 years, said one of the Directorate, a being of the Clith who resembled a slow storm contained in glass. We have fleets. We have not fought. Then we will relearn, Valoran said. She had been silent through most of the deliberation, and when she spoke the others turned to her, because she was the eldest and her word carried the weight of ages. The knowledge exists. It is in the founding records. We built the ring of dead stars. we can hold the gap in it. The difficulty is not capacity. The difficulty is that we have grown accustomed to letting younger species do the holding, and now we must remember how to do it ourselves. This will be uncomfortable. It will not be impossible. She paused, and something in her paused with her. We will also, she said more quietly, recall the human worlds. The hall went still. The humans withdrew, the speaker said, by their own choice. To recall them now would be to reward the withdrawal. Every associate species watching would learn that they can extort the conquered by threatening to leave. It would be the end of the order. The order, Valoran said, is currently being eaten. I would rather have a compromised order than a devoured one. Send to the human worlds. Offer them full membership. Offer them a seat on the directorate itself if that is what it takes. But get them back onto the meridian gap before the breach widens past our capacity to close it. Because I have read the same founding records you have, and I will tell you what they say between the lines, which none of you seem willing to read. We did not build the ring of dead stars to keep out an enemy we could defeat. We built it to keep out an enemy we could not. The humans found a way to hold that enemy at a door we could only ever lock. I do not know how they did it. I know only that we must have them doing it again. And so, for the first time in the recorded history of the Concord of Worlds, the Directorate sent an emissary to a species that had walked away and asked it to come back. The emissary was a Thren of Valoran's own lineage, a younger cathedral of pale coral named Sethran, and Sethran arrived at Earth expecting to be received with the desperate gratitude of a species being offered salvation. What Sethran found instead was a conference room in a gray building, and a table, and on the far side of the table, an old soldier named Vance and a young woman named Sena Adeyemi. And the young woman was doing something Sethran had never in 3,000 years of diplomacy experienced. She was listening to the offer of everything the human worlds had ever wanted: full membership, a directorate seat, the reversal of the entire judgment of the Ice Hall, and she was, very gently, saying no. You misunderstand why we left, Sena said. She was 24 and she sat across from a being older than her homeworld's oceans, and she was not afraid. And Sethran found the absence of fear disorienting, because Sethran was accustomed to being the oldest thing in any room and having that mean something. You think we left to get a better offer. You think this was a negotiation, and that 8 months of the gap falling apart has finally moved your price to where we wanted it. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a divorce. We didn't leave to be chased. We left because your entire order is built on the assumption that species like us exist to be spent, and no seat on your directorate changes that assumption. It just gives us a nicer chair while we're being spent. The frontier is falling, Sethran said, and there was beneath the ancient composure the first honest note the being had produced. Millions will die, associate species who never wronged you. The Sethuvian are already gone, the whole sector, Commander Osk with it. Something flickered across Sena's face at the name. She had never met Osk, but she had read Idris's report, and she knew what the man had done and how, and into what silence he had sent his last words. I know about Osk, she said quietly. I know exactly what happened to him, because we spent 11 years learning how to keep it from happening, and then you decided that knowledge was worth less than your pride, and you let him inherit a job you never taught him how to do. Don't put Osk on us. Osk is on you. Then help us, Sethran said. For his sake, if not for ours, come back to the gap. And here Sena did something that surprised even Vance, who had watched her for 8 months and thought she understood her. She leaned forward, and her voice lost its edge. And for a moment she was not a negotiator or a symbol, but simply a young person trying to make an old and powerful creature understand a truth it was constructed not to see. I would help you in a heartbeat, she said. That's the part you can't understand, isn't it? We're not vindictive. If you came to us as equals and said, we are afraid, we do not know how to hold the line, teach us, we will stand beside you, we would say yes before you finished asking. Humans are like that. It's almost a weakness. But that's not what you're doing. You're doing the thing you always do. You're offering to promote us so that we'll go back to dying in your place. You want to buy the fire so you can keep sitting by it. And the answer is no, not because we're angry, but because it wouldn't even work. You can't hire the thing that held the gap. The thing that held the gap wasn't our ships or our guns or our catalog of the enemy, though we had all of that. It was that 30,000 human beings decided, individually, every single day, that the line would not fall on their watch, and they were willing to die to make that true, and no amount of membership makes anyone decide that. You either have people like that or you don't. And you don't. You gave yours away 100,000 years ago and called it maturity. Sethrin sat in the gray room and processed this, and the processing took a long time, because the being was encountering, for the first time in its enormous life, a wall it could not go around. Every tool of conquered diplomacy assumed that the other party wanted something the conquered could provide. It had no tool for a species that wanted nothing the conquered had. "What would it take?" Sethrin said at last, and the question came out smaller than intended, "for you to help us." Sena and Vance exchanged a look. It was Vance who answered, because the answer was hers to give. "We're not coming back to the gap," the old woman said. "That door is closed and it stays closed," but she let the word sit. "Humanity isn't the conquered, we never were, and there are millions of people out there, your people, associate people, whole species being ground up because your ancestors built a wall and then forgot how to guard it. We are not indifferent to that. We're human. Indifference to dying people is the one thing we've never managed, even when it would have been smart." She leaned back. "So here is what we'll do, and it is the only thing we'll do. We will not defend the conquered. We will not rejoin the conquered, but we will open our worlds to any species that wants to leave the conquered and come stand with us. We'll take your refugees. We'll take your soldiers who are tired of dying for people who won't fight. We'll teach anyone who comes to us how to actually hold a line, not the conquered's way, our way, the way that works. We'll build something new, out past the core where you never bothered to look. And if enough of your species decide they'd rather be free and alive with us than safe and doomed with you," she smiled. And it was Sena's smile, the one from the ice hall, the smile of someone who could see the whole board. "Then your problem won't be the things coming through the gap. Your problem will be that there's nobody left inside your walls but the 9 oldest cowards in the galaxy, wondering where everyone went." Sethrin returned to the conquered with that answer and delivered it to the directorate, and for the second time the ice hall fell into a silence it did not understand, because the humans had not refused to help. They had done something far more dangerous. They had offered to help everyone except the conquered, and in doing so they had turned the entire logic of the galaxy inside out. For 100,000 years, the conquered had been the only safety. Now, for the first time, there was a second door. And a second door meant a choice. And the directorate, listening to Sethrin recount the words of an old soldier and a girl who was not afraid of them, understood at last that they had not merely lost a frontier. They had lost their monopoly on hope. To understand why the conquered could not simply relearn what humanity had known, you have to understand what the humans had actually done in the Meridian Gap. And to understand that, you have to go back to a night 3 years before the Ice Hall, to a war that no historian of the conquered ever bothered to record, because it was fought by an associate species over a stretch of nothing that the old ones did not consider worth a name. Colonel Idris, she had been a captain then, had held a picket for 6 days against a minor incursion, the kind the conquered's records dismissed as background noise, and on the 6th day she had watched a thing come through the dark that the ancient manuals said was impossible, an incursion that learned. It changed its approach vector every time her guns found the range. It probed her formation for the seam, and having found it once, went for the same seam every subsequent night. The founding records, written 100,000 years earlier, described the enemy of the vast as a force, a tide, a weather. The humans, 6 days into holding a line the conquered thought was empty, discovered that it was not weather. It was hungry, and it was patient, and above all it was watching, exactly the way they watched, and the only thing that had ever kept it out was that the beings on the wall watched harder. That was the whole secret, and it could not be transferred because it was not knowledge. It was a posture. The Concord's founding species had built the ring of dead stars precisely so they would never have to hold this posture, so they could lock the door and walk away and let the lock do the watching. And a lock does not watch. A lock simply holds until the thing on the other side learns the lock, and then it fails all at once. For 100,000 years, the ring had held because nothing had been pressing on it hard enough to learn it. The humans, arriving on the frontier young and desperate and afraid, had pressed themselves into the gap where the lock was weakest, and in doing so they had become the thing the conquered had stopped being, a wall that watched back. Humanity spent 11 years refining that posture into a science. They mapped the enemy's learning curve. They discovered that if you changed your defensive seam faster than the incursion could learn it, you could hold indefinitely with a fraction of the firepower the manuals demanded. That the entire conquered doctrine of overwhelming static formations was not just inefficient but actively wrong, because a static formation was a lesson the enemy only had to learn once. They discovered the third harmonic, the subsonic pulse that ran ahead of a true incursion, distinct from the constant low noise of the probing, the signature that told you the tide was about to come in earnest. They learned to read it the way a fisher reads the sea. They wrote it all down, every hard-won page, in a doctrine they never once shared with the conquered because the conquered had never once asked. Why would it? The frontier was holding. The associates were holding it. Everything was fine. And then humanity took the doctrine and walked, and the conquered inherited a lock it did not know how to turn, standing before a door that had spent 11 years learning exactly how the lock worked. This is why the full-member fleets died in the ancient formations. They were not cowards, whatever Vance had called them in her anger. They were performing flawlessly a doctrine designed for an enemy that did not learn, against an enemy that had been learning for 11 years and had just been handed the greatest gift of its long existence, defenders who had stopped changing the seam. The first conquered fleet at the Meridian Gap held a textbook formation for 6 hours, and the incursion went straight for the seam it had been probing for a decade. The seam Idris used to change every 90 minutes, and it did not have to learn anything at all. It simply walked through the door the humans had left standing open when they took the key. Valoran learned all of this slowly over the 3 years in fragments, from captured incursion telemetry, from the few Sethuvian survivors who had served alongside the humans, and finally, near the end, from the Free Reach itself, which under Sena's direction did the one thing the conquered had never done. It published its doctrine, openly. To everyone, enemy analysts and rival species alike, on the reasoning that a posture cannot be stolen the way a weapon can, because a posture requires the will to hold it, and the will could not be copied out of a document. Valoran read the human doctrine and understood in the reading the full dimension of the mistake she had made. The humans had not been fuel. They had been the galaxy's only working immune system, and the conquered had looked at its immune system and been annoyed that it kept fever-flushing the borders, and had decided the cure was to make the immune system feel unwelcome enough to leave. She thought often in those years about the moment in the ice hall, about the girl in the blue light who had said, "You looked at us and you saw fuel." She had assumed it was rhetoric, the rhetoric of a young species that overvalued its own contribution, the way the young always did. It had not occurred to her, it had not been able to occur to her, that the egg in the outer ring had access to a truth that the entire directorate lacked, which was simply the truth of having stood on the wall. Valoran had ruled the frontier for 90,000 years and had never once stood on it. Sena Adeyemi had stood on it for 4. It turned out that 4 years of standing on a thing taught you more about it than 90,000 years of ruling it from a hall of ice. And this single fact, so obvious in retrospect that it made the eldest of the Thren want to weep, was the fact that the entire architecture of the conquered had been designed to prevent anyone from noticing. The old ones ruled from above so they would never have to stand below. And in never standing below, they had forgotten that the whole galaxy rested on the below, on the wall, on the watchers, on the endlessly renewed decision of frightened people to hold a line one more hour. They had built a civilization that mistook the roof for the foundation, and when the foundation walked away, the roof had discovered, far too late, that it had never learned to stand on its own. The Conquered did not accept its diagnosis quietly. Before Valoran ever came to Earth, before the road out of the Conquered was even a trickle, the Directorate made 3 attempts to solve the problem the way old powers always try to solve problems: by force, by money, and by fraud, in that order, and each attempt taught the galaxy a little more about the difference between the Conquered and the thing humanity had become. The first attempt was force. When humanity refused the recall and opened its worlds to refugees, a faction of the Directorate, led by the Clith, the Storm in Glass, argued that the humans were committing something close to treason, draining the Conquered of its populations at the exact moment the Conquered needed them most. The remedy, the Clith proposed, was a blockade. Station full-member fleets along the trade routes out of the core and turn back any ship attempting to reach the free reach. The proposal was adopted over Valoran's objection, and for 4 months the Conquered tried to wall its own people in. It failed, and it failed in a way that taught the Directorate its first real lesson about the new galaxy. The blockade required the full-member fleets to stand a line, the very thing they had proven they could not do. But it was worse than that, because this was not a line against the mindless tide of the vast. It was a line against ships crewed by beings the blockading fleets knew, associate species they had served beside, refugees carrying children. The Conquered crews were ordered to fire on the desperate to keep them from freedom, and crew after crew refused. Some simply opened the blockade and let the refugees through. Some defected and flew their own ships to the free reach. Within 4 months, the blockade had not slowed the exodus at all, and had instead become the single greatest recruiting instrument the free reach ever had, because nothing radicalizes a wavering population like being shot at for trying to leave. Valoran, watching the blockade dissolve, understood that the Conquered had just discovered the limit of force. You cannot make people die for an order by threatening to kill them if they try to live under a different one. Humanity had understood that intuitively. It had walked away rather than be spent. Now everyone was walking away, and the guns meant to stop them had become the reason to go. The second attempt was money, and it was Valoran's own. When force failed, the Directorate authorized her to offer the free reaches arriving species everything the Conquered had ever withheld: full membership, ancient technologies, seats at every table, retroactively and without conditions. It was a genuine offer, made in genuine desperation, and it was the most generous the Conquered had made in 100,000 years, and it did not work either. It did not work because it arrived too late to be about generosity, and everyone knew it. A gift given freely means one thing. The identical gift given only when the giver is drowning means something else entirely. It means the gift was always affordable and was withheld anyway, for reasons that had nothing to do with cost. The associate species did the arithmetic Sena had taught them without ever meaning to teach it, and the arithmetic said, they always could have treated us as equals. They simply never wanted to until they needed us. And a species that will only value you when it needs you is a species you cannot ever trust to value you again, once the need has passed. The refugees took the offer as proof of everything the humans had said, and kept flying outward, and the Conquered's most generous act in 90,000 years bought it nothing but the confirmation of its own worst reputation. The third attempt was fraud, and it was the ugliest, and Valoran spent the rest of her long life ashamed that she had allowed it. A faction of the Directorate, seeing that neither force nor money could hold the Conquered's peoples, resolved to hold them with a lie. They fabricated intelligence, reports that the Free Reach's frontier had fallen, that the human worlds had been overrun, that the road outward led not to safety, but to a slaughter the humans were hiding. They seeded these reports through the relays, timed to reach wavering populations at the moment of decision. It was a sophisticated lie, built by minds that had 100,000 years of practice in saying one thing and meaning another. It lasted 9 days. It lasted 9 days because the free reach did the one thing the Concord's entire history had never prepared it for. It told the truth, loudly, constantly, and verifiably. Every sector the free reach held, it broadcast the telemetry openly. Every incursion it stopped, it published in full. When the Concord's fabricated reports of a fallen human frontier hit the relays, the free reach simply pointed to 3 years of unbroken, independently verifiable, publicly logged defense, and asked the galaxy to compare. And the galaxy compared, and saw that the free reach's line had never once fallen while the Concord's fell weakly, and concluded that if either party was lying about the state of the frontier, it was obviously not the one whose frontier was actually holding. The fraud did not merely fail, it inverted. It became the moment a great many undecided species stopped being undecided, because a power that lies to keep you is a power that has already told you exactly how much your life is worth to it. 3 attempts, force, money, fraud. Each one a tool that had worked for the Concord for 100,000 years, and each one useless against a thing that could not be coerced because it had already proven it would rather leave than be coerced, could not be bought because it wanted nothing the Concord had, and could not be deceived because it had built its entire new order out of the refusal to deceive. Sena Adeyemi had not planned this. She had simply understood from the beginning that the Concord's power was a power over people who believed they had no alternative, and that the instant an alternative existed, every instrument of that power would turn to smoke. She had created the alternative with 2 words in an ice hall. Everything the Concord did afterward only proved how completely those 2 words had rewritten the rules. By the time Valoran finally made the journey to Earth to ask her real question, the Concord had exhausted every tool it possessed and discovered that it possessed no tool at all for the situation it was in, which was simply the situation of an old power that had been left. Not defeated, not conquered, left. And there is no manual, in any archive, in any species, for how a thing that has spent 100,000 years being the only choice learns to live in a galaxy where it has become one option among 2, and the worse one. That was the true fatal mistake, the one beneath all the others. Not that the Concord had called humanity fuel, but that in 100,000 years of being unquestioned, it had forgotten there was any question, had forgotten that its power had always been contingent on there being nowhere else to go, and had treated a contingent thing as though it were eternal, until a 23-year-old stood up in the outer ring and demonstrated, with 2 words and a single step toward the door, that the Emperor's throne had never had legs at all. It had only ever had the fact that no one had tried to stand up from it. Humanity stood up, and the whole thing fell. The free reach was not built the way the Concord had been built. That difference, more than any battle, was what ultimately decided the fate of the galaxy, and it is worth understanding, because it explains why a scattering of the discarded outperformed the accumulated might of 100,000 years. The Concord had been built downward from the top. The oldest species had established the rules, drawn the borders, and then admitted younger species into a structure already complete, on terms already fixed. A new species did not shape the Concord shaped it, filing down its edges until it fit the slot prepared for it. This produced enormous stability and total stagnation, because a structure that only ever absorbs and never adapts eventually faces a problem its founders never imagined and discovers it has no mechanism for imagining anything new. The Concord's response to every novel threat was to consult a record written by beings 100,000 years dead. It was a civilization run entirely by the past. The free reach was built the opposite way, sideways from the middle, and it was built that way for the simple reason that no one in it had the authority to build it any other way. When the Sethuvian survivors arrived, humanity did not have a slot prepared for them. It had a half-finished shipyard and a defensive line and a question: will you stand? The Sethuvian, who had just watched their whole doctrine of static formations get their commander killed, said yes, and then they said something the Conquered would never have permitted an associate to say: we have an idea about the formations. And humanity, instead of consulting a record, listened. The Sethuvian idea was good. It went into the doctrine. When the Coral arrived, they had an idea about sensor fusion across mixed fleets, and that went in too. The HFY brought a way of managing fear in crews that no human had ever thought of, and it saved more lives than any weapon. The Free Reach's doctrine was not written by the dead. It was written every week, by whoever had just learned something on the line, and it got better every week, forever. Because the one rule underneath all its other rules was that the newest arrival might see the thing the oldest hand had missed. This was Sena's real work, and it was harder than any battle. 100 species do not naturally cohere. They have different fears, different reflexes, different ways of saying yes that look like no and no that looks like yes. The Conquered had solved this problem by flattening everyone into a single imposed procedure and punishing deviation. Sena solved it the human way, which was translation, not of words, which the implants handled, but of intent, the thing she had been the best in her species at since she was 19. She would sit in a room with a Sethuvian gunnery chief and a Coral sensor lead who each thought the other was being reckless, and she would find the sentence, the single reframing, that let each of them see that the other was actually being careful in a way their own species did not have a word for. She did this 10,000 times. She did it until the Free Reach fleets could fight as one organism made of 100 species, each contributing the thing it did best, and that organism was something the galaxy had never seen, because the Conquered had spent 100,000 years making sure it could never form. Diversity, to the Conquered, was a management problem to be minimized. To the Free Reach it was the entire source of strength, because 100 species watching a wall see 100 kinds of danger, and the wall that sees the most kinds of danger is the wall that never falls. Sena was on that wall herself, more than a symbol needed to be, because she had learned early that the line believed what it saw and not what it was told. There is a difference between a leader who sends people to hold a border and a leader who is holding it beside them, and every species in the Free Reach could feel the difference in their bones, even when they could not have named it. So the girl who had walked out of the ice hall spent her mid-20s on the outer perimeter, in the cold and the fear and the endless renewed decision, translating 100 species into one and holding the seam that never stayed still. She lost people. She wrote to their families in 100 languages. She learned the thing every real commander learns, which is that you cannot hold a line without loving the people on it, and you cannot love them without it costing you something every time the line takes one, and that the cost is not a flaw in the system, but the whole reason the system works, because a wall held by people who love each other does not break at the point where a wall held by strangers always does. The Conquered's analysts, watching from their falling worlds, could not understand how the Free Reach's numbers worked. By every metric the Conquered tracked, tonnage, firepower, population, age, the Free Reach should have been weaker. It was smaller. Its ships were cruder. Its species were, individually, less advanced than the ancient full members. And yet it held lines the Conquered could not hold with 10 times the force, and the analysts filled report after report with the discrepancy, and never once identified the variable, because the variable was not on any of their instruments. The variable was that every being in the Free Reach had chosen to be there, and choosing changes a soldier at a level no sensor reads. A conscript holds until fear outweighs duty. A volunteer holds until fear outweighs love, and love, it turns out, is heavier than duty by an amount that decides wars. The Conquered had spent 100,000 years perfecting duty and had never once tried to build love, because love could not be commanded from a throne of ice, and everything the Conquered had was commanded from a throne of ice. That was the thing Valoran finally came to Earth to understand, though she did not yet have the words for it when she set out. She came thinking she needed to learn humanity's tactics. She left understanding that the tactics were downstream of something she did not know how to build and was not sure her species even possessed: the capacity to make people want to hold the wall. The Free Reach had built a galaxy people ran toward. The Concord had built a galaxy people ran from. And in the end, in a universe with a door in the dark and things pressing on it, the only galaxy that survives is the one people are running toward, because a wall is only as strong as the number of hands that choose to hold it, and hands cannot be conscripted forever. They can only be earned. The Concord had never learned to earn anything. It had only ever learned to take. And now, at the end of 100,000 years, it discovered that the one thing you cannot take is the will to save you, and that this one thing was and had always been the only thing that mattered. They came like water finding a crack. It began with the Sethuvian, what was left of them. The ship's Osk had emptied of civilians before his sector fell, 40,000 survivors who had nowhere in the Concord to go, because the Concord's response to a fallen sector was to redraw the map behind it and pretend the loss had always been the border. Someone among the survivors remembered a transmission, the old human command frequency. The promise Idris had made to Osk without quite meaning it: watch the third harmonic, and if the worst comes, you'll know where we went. The Sethuvian sent one ship out past the core, following a trail of human trade beacons that had been quietly left burning for exactly this purpose, and the ship found a system the humans had begun to build in, raw and half-finished, and utterly unlike the frozen grandeur of the Concord, all working shipyards and blunt fortifications, and a defensive line already going up around the whole approach. The Sethuvian ship transmitted a single question. The humans answered by opening a corridor and guiding them in. Then the Sethuvian sent for the rest of their people, and the Coral, who had lost 2 sectors, heard about it from the Sethuvian, and the Ivthi heard about it from the Coral. And within a year of the Meridian Gap's first breach, there was a road out of the Concord that had never existed before, a slow, steady current of species deciding that they would rather be refugees in something new than corpses in something old, and every one of them arrived at the human worlds and found the same thing waiting: not charity and not exploitation, but a hand extended and a question asked. Will you stand? And if you'll stand, we'll teach you how. Sena Adeyemi, 25 now, spent that year not in conference rooms but on the new line, the outer defensive perimeter of what the arriving species had started, half seriously and then entirely seriously, to call the Free Reach. She was not a soldier, but she was the human who could sit in a room full of a dozen frightened species who had never fought together and did not share a language of war, and tell each of them what the others meant, and weld them, translation by translation, into something that could hold. She had walked away from the Concord with 2 words. She spent the following years earning them back one alliance at a time. The Concord, meanwhile, learned to fight, and it was terrible at it. Not for lack of resource. The full member species had fleets that dwarfed anything the Free Reach could field, weapons refined across geological time, ships that were works of art. What they lacked was the thing Sena had named in the Gray Room, the thing you either have or you don't. They sent their fleets to the Meridian Gap, and the fleets performed the ancient formations flawlessly and died anyway, because holding a frontier is not a performance. It is a decision renewed every hour under conditions designed to break the will to renew it, and the full member species had spent 100,000 years unlearning how to make that decision. Their crews were brave in the way of people who have never been tested. When the third harmonic rose and the pressure wave came, and the things without names began to pour through the dark, that bravery discovered its own bottom, and the fleets that did not die broke and ran, and the breach widened, and the Concord fell back and back and back toward its own heart. Valoran watched it happen from the ice hall, and she did the arithmetic that the eldest of a species is required to do, and the arithmetic was pitiless. At the current rate, the frontier would collapse entirely within a decade. The vast would pour into the settled galaxy, And the Concord, the institution, the order, the great old certainty that had ruled since before humanity's sun had cooled, would end, not with a war it lost, but with a job it had forgotten how to do. She went to Earth herself. This was unheard of. The eldest of the directorate did not travel, the galaxy came to her. But Valoran had spent 9,000 years being the wisest mind in every room, and she had finally encountered a problem that her wisdom could not solve from a throne of ice. And so, she made the journey herself, an ancient cathedral of coral crossing the galaxy to sit, at last, across a table from the girl who had told her the truth and been disbelieved. Sena was 26. They met on the Free Reach's central world, in a room that was not gray and not frozen but simply functional, and Valoran looked at the human and found her changed, harder around the eyes, the way people get when they have spent years holding a line and watching people die on it, and yet fundamentally the same, still not afraid, still able to see the whole board. "You told me," Valoran said, without preamble, because there was no longer time for the long approaches of conquered diplomacy, "that I would sit in a room and understand what I had decided. I have understood it. I understood it the day the Sethuvian sector fell. I am not here to negotiate, because I have finally grasped that there is nothing I can offer you that you want. I am here to ask you a question, and to accept whatever answer you give, because you have earned the right to give it and I have earned the obligation to hear it." The great pale head bowed, and it was not the fractional courtesy of the ice hall but a full and genuine lowering, a thing Sena understood to be, from a being like Valoran, an act very close to kneeling. "The frontier is going to fall. My species is going to end. Many species are going to end. I made a decision in that hall that a whole galaxy is going to die of. Tell me, is there any road left that does not end in the dark? Or did I close the last one when I called you fuel and let you walk?" And Sena Adeyemi, who had waited 3 years for an old and powerful being to ask her a real question instead of offering her a bribe, looked at the eldest of the conquered and gave her the truth, exactly as she always had. "There's a road," she said. "There was always a road. You just couldn't see it because it required you to stop being the thing you are. And I don't know if you can." She stood, and she walked to the window where the shipyards of the Free Reach burned bright against the dark, thousands of species building something together that the conquered in 100,000 years had never managed to build. The Free Reach can hold the frontier. We're already doing it. We've stopped the incursions cold on our own perimeter, and we've never lost a sector, not one, because the species who come to us come as volunteers and we teach them the thing that actually matters and they stay taught. We could hold the gap. We could push the vast back behind the ring of dead stars where your ancestors put it. We have the will and we're building the strength. We could save the whole galaxy, Valoran, yours included." She turned. "But not for the conquered, and not as the conquered's hired fire. The road is this, and it's the only one, and you're not going to like it. The conquered has to end. Not be conquered, end. Dissolve itself. Every species in it walks out of the ice hall the way we did as free peoples, and any of them who want to join the Free Reach come as equals, and we hold the frontier together, as a thing we all chose, instead of a thing the old ones spend the young ones to maintain." She let that land. "You asked if there's a road that doesn't end in the dark. There is, but it ends with you giving up the one thing you've held onto for 100,000 years. It ends with the conquered choosing to stop existing so that everyone in it can live. That's the price. It was always the price. I just couldn't make you see it 3 years ago, because 3 years ago you weren't afraid yet, and only the afraid can hear it." Valoran was silent for a long, long time. Outside, the shipyards burned. Somewhere on the perimeter, a mixed fleet of a dozen species held a line that had never once broken, because every being on it had chosen to be there. "You are 26 years old," the Thren said at last, and there was wonder in it, and grief, and something that in a younger creature might have been the beginning of hope. "How is it that you understood at 23, a thing that 9 of us could not understand in 90,000 years?" "Because you were never afraid," Sena said gently. I was raised by a species that has never once, in its entire history, stopped being afraid. Fear taught us to watch. Watching taught us to see. That's the whole secret. That's the thing you looked at and called adolescence. It was never a weakness. It was the only reason any of us are still here. She came back to the table and sat down across from the eldest mind in the galaxy, and she folded her hands, and she said, in the tone of someone beginning a very long and very difficult piece of work, "Now, you came a long way to ask me a question. Do you want to hear how we'd actually do it? Because if you do, if you're really ready to end the Concord to save the galaxy, then we should probably start today. The third harmonic doesn't wait for old species to make up their minds." And Valoran of the Thren, eldest of the Directorate, ruler of 100,000 years, looked at the young human who had walked away and been proven right, and made the second hardest decision of her enormous life, which was to trust her. "Yes," she said, "tell me how." The work of ending the Concord was not a decision but a war, and it was the strangest war the galaxy ever fought, because it was fought inside the ice hall with words while the real war burned outside it in the dark, and the two were the same war, and everyone knew it. Valoran carried Sena's plan back to the six who had refused her, and she did not argue tactics, because tactics were not the disagreement. The disagreement was whether the Concord was a means or an end. To Valoran, after Earth, the Concord had become a means, a tool for keeping the galaxy's people safe, and a tool that had stopped working, and a tool one therefore set down. To the six, the Concord was the end itself, the thing safety existed to preserve rather than the other way around, and to dissolve it to save its peoples was to them a contradiction in terms, like burning a house to save the idea of the house. They were not stupid. They were old in a way that had made the distinction invisible to them, the way a being who has held its breath for 100,000 years forgets that breathing was ever the point, and comes to believe that the holding is. So Valoran did the only thing left. She did not convince them. She simply began to act as though the Concord were already a means, and invited every species that agreed with her to act the same way, and let the dissolution happen not by decree but by attrition. Each world that fell to the vast and was abandoned by the Concord's failing defense, she released, formally, in the empty hall, declaring it free to seek its own safety. Each associate species that petitioned to leave, she let leave and signed the release herself, until the signing became routine and then became the only business the Directorate conducted. The six raged. But raging is a thing you do from a throne, and the thrones were emptying, world by world and species by species, until the ice hall that had once held 2,000 delegates held 9, and then 6, and then near the end only 3, Valoran and 2 who had come slowly to see what she saw. That was the true dissolution, not a vote, a hall that emptied because everyone in it finally had somewhere better to go. The Concord did not fall. It was left, exactly as humanity had left it, one delegate at a time following the 2 words a girl had spoken in the outer ring, until there was no one to hold the order, and the order simply stopped, the way a fist stops when the hand decides to open. And the hand decided to open because Valoran, alone in the ice hall with the glacier singing over her head, finally understood that a fist closed for 100,000 years is not strength. It is only a hand that has forgotten it was ever meant to hold something, and has held nothing but itself so long that the holding has become the only thing it knows, long after there is anything left inside it worth the grip. She opened the hand, and then she went to the sealed gap, to the girl who had taught her how, to say the thing she had promised she would come to understand, and to ask the last question of her long life, and to hear the answer, and to learn whether the galaxy she had nearly killed would let her help hold it after all. It is one thing for the eldest of a species to decide that her order must end. It is another for the order to agree to die. Directorate did not agree. When Valoran returned to the ice hall and laid before the 9 the only road that did not end in the dark, dissolution, equality, the Concord unmade so that its peoples might live, 6 of them refused. They refused not out of malice but out of the deepest instinct any old thing possesses, the instinct to persist. The conquered was existence itself to them. To end it to save the galaxy was, in their reckoning, indistinguishable from ending the galaxy to save nothing. Better to fight and lose as the conquered than to survive as something smaller. And so the ice hall split, and while it split, the frontier died. It died fast in the end. That is the thing the old species never understood about collapse, that it is patient for a long time, and then it is not patient at all. The meridian breach met a second breach at the coral line, and the two joined, and the ring of dead stars that had held the vast for 100,000 years unzipped along a front no fleet could cover. The full-member worlds began to fall. Not frontier sectors now, not associate pickets, home worlds, ancient capitals, cathedrals of ice and coral and glass that had stood since before the human sun was born. The vast did not negotiate and did not tire and did not forget how to fight, and it came inward like a tide that had been held back 100 millennia and was owed every year of it. Sena Adeyemi watched the reports come in and did not gloat because she was human, and the one thing humans have never managed is indifference to dying people. She had walked away from the conquered. She had never walked away from the galaxy. And when the sixth conquered home world fell and the refugee tide swelled from a current into a flood, she stood before the assembled species of the free reach, Sethuvian and Coral and Ivthi and 100 others, and humans, and behind them all the shipyards still burning, and she made the argument that would decide everything. We could hold our own perimeter and let the conquered die, she said. It would be safe. It would even be just. They made their bed, and 6 of their 9 oldest just chose it again with their eyes open. Nobody would blame us. We'd survive. The free reach would go on, and in 1,000 years we'd be the only thing left and we'd have done nothing wrong. She looked out at the dozens of species who had crossed the galaxy to stand with her. And it would be the exact thing we left the conquered to escape. Because the conquered's whole sin was this: they decided some lives were worth spending and some weren't. They looked at us and saw fuel. If we hold our line and let their people burn, then we've just drawn the circle smaller and put ourselves inside it. We haven't ended the conquered sin. We've inherited it. She let the shipyards burn behind her. So we're not going to do that. We're going to do the hard thing, the human thing, the thing that's almost a weakness. We're going out past our own line into a collapse that isn't ours to save people who spent 100,000 years using us. Not because they deserve it, because we're the kind of people who do it anyway. That's the whole reason we're worth anything. Let's go prove it. They went. The Free Reach fleet that jumped for the Meridian Gap was the strangest armada the galaxy had ever assembled. 100 species ships flying formations no manual had ever contained, welded together by a young woman's translations and by 3 years of choosing, every single day, to stand. It was smaller than the Conquered's fleets had been. It was made of worse ships. And it did the thing the Conquered's fleets could never do, which was arrive at a falling line and not break, because every crew on it had already decided, individually in the privacy of their own fear, that the line would not fall on their watch. Sena had told Valoran the secret, and it had sounded almost too simple to be true, and it was. You either have people who decide that, or you don't. The Free Reach had them. It had gone out into the galaxy, and gathered every being who was tired of dying for others, and taught them to stand for each other instead. And that changed everything, because a being will break holding a line for the old cowards who spend him, and will not break holding it for the people beside him who chose to be there too. They stopped the vast at the 3rd breach. Then they held the 2nd. Then, over 8 brutal months that cost the Free Reach more than it had ever paid for anything, with Sena Adeyemi on the command deck reading the intent of 100 captains at once, and speaking the single language that let them fight as one thing. They pushed the tide back through the Meridian Gap and out into the dark, and they closed it, not with the ancient formations, but with the ugly refined human science of holding, updated and rebuilt, and handed freely to every species that would learn it. And when the gap was sealed, when the ring of dead stars burned whole again for the first time in 3 years, 3 of the 9 directorate remained alive, Valoran among them, and they came to the sealed gap in a single small ship, the last authority of an order that had lost 6 of its home worlds and most of its certainty, and everything it had ever believed made it eternal. They asked for Sena. She met Valoran on the command deck, with the closed gap burning steady in the display behind them, and 100 species fleets holding the line they had earned. "It's done," Valoran said. "The Concord is dissolved. I dissolved it myself this morning in an empty ice hall with 2 others to witness." There was almost no one left to object. The great pale head bowed fully, without reservation. "You were right in every particular. You were right at 23 in the outer ring, where we placed you so we would not have to hear you. We heard you anyway. We simply refused to believe an egg could see what 9 ancients could not." She was quiet a moment. "You told us we would sit in that hall and understand exactly what we had decided. I understood it alone at the end, with the ice singing over my head and no one left to say it to. So I have come to say it to you instead, because you are the only one who earned the right to hear it. We made a fatal mistake. We looked at the one species that could save us and we called it fuel and we let it walk away, and it cost us 100,000 years and 6 worlds and nearly everything, and the only reason the galaxy still stands is that the species we discarded turned out to be the one that couldn't discard us back." She lifted her head. "You could have let us die. I would have. Why didn't you?" Sena Adeyemi was 27 now. She had walked away from the galaxy's great order with 2 words and spent 4 years building a better one out of everyone the old order had thrown away. She looked at the eldest surviving mind in the galaxy, and she gave her, one final time, the truth. "Because walking away was never the point," she said. "You thought we left out of pride and then out of leverage, and you spent 3 years trying to buy us back because you couldn't imagine any other reason. But we didn't leave to be chased, and we didn't leave to be begged. We left because you'd built a galaxy where the strong sat safe and spent the young in the dark, and the only way to break it was to take the young and walk, not to abandon anyone. To prove there was another way to live, one where nobody's fuel, where everyone who stands the line chose to stand it, where the oldest and the youngest hold the wall side by side because they both decided the wall matters." She gestured at the fleet behind her, 100 species burning steady against the dark. "That's the thing you couldn't see, right to the end. We never wanted to leave you behind. We wanted you to follow, and now you have." She almost smiled, and it was gentler than the smile from the ice hall, though it was the same smile underneath. "Welcome to the free reach, Valoran. There's a place on the line for you. You'll have to learn to be afraid again. It's the only way anyone learns to watch, and watching is the only way anyone learns to see. But you've got time. We all do now. That's what walking away bought." She put out her hand, the old human gesture, offered to a cathedral of coral older than her homeworld seas. "Come and stand with us, not above, with us. It's all we ever wanted, and it's the only thing that was ever going to save you." And Valoran of the Thren, who had once ruled 100,000 years from a throne of ice, and had lived long enough to learn that she had understood nothing, reached out one pale limb and took the hand of a 27-year-old human, and stepped down off her throne at last, and joined the line. Behind them the meridian gap burned closed and whole, held by everyone the galaxy had once thrown away, and it never fell again.